Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of New York Shakespeare. For those of you who are new to the realm of New York Shakespeare, my name is Rodney Hakim. I'm the voice behind the New York Shakespeare social media feeds, and we try to bring you as much Shakespeare as we can that is happening in and around New York. This month in September and even into October, we are shifting our focus away from theater and film and some of the performative art, and we are focusing our spotlight on Shakespeare books and education. It is, after all, back to school season, and we have a bunch of exciting things happening in the educational front here in New York City, with a lot of classes and lectures and various things that are happening. And we are excited to extend beyond the geographical limits of New York all the way across the pond, so to speak, to the UK, to have a chat this afternoon with one of our esteemed colleagues in the world of Shakespeare, all the way from Shakespeare's Birthplace Trust, let me say that correctly, in Stratford-upon-Avon in the UK, and that is Dr. Darren Freebury-Jones. Hello, Darren.
Hello, Rodney. Thank you so much for having me on. It's an absolute pleasure.
It's a pleasure. And for those who might not be familiar, Dr. Darren Freebury-Jones is one of the renowned names in the world of Shakespeare lecturing and Shakespeare scholarship. He is over at the Shakespeare I keep on saying birthday. I don't know. Somehow that's rolling off my tongue. The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust over at Shakespeare-upon-Avon. And Darren, what is your specialty over at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust?
It's a fine error to make, because the Birthplace Trust were originally known as the Birthday Committee when they were set up in 1847. So you're being pretty accurate there, Rodney. Actually, it's all good.
But yeah, greater truth than than what the current name is.
You've done your homework. You've done your homework.
That's right.
From a lecturing perspective, I mean, I lecture on a huge number of topics to audiences across life's journey, really. So from children to high school students to college students, university students, prospective teachers, leisure learners, and on such topics as, different plays or gender in Shakespeare or particular genres such as Shakespeare and history. But my particular research specialism, I think, is in Shakespeare and contemporary playwrights of the period, how he was influenced by them, how he collaborated with them, and so forth.
And you have two books that have recently been released in the past few months or past year or two. One of them being about Robert Greene, entitled Reading Robert Greene, Recovering Shakespeare's Rival, and the other, I believe more recent, being Shakespeare's Tutor, The Influence of Thomas Kyd. Now, in which time frame were those released, Darren?
So they were both released last year, 2022. So the book on Robert Greene was released in the summer, and the Thomas Kyd book was released in December as an early Christmas present.
Very, very nice. And you have another book that you're contributing to also about Thomas Kyd, and that is the Complete Works of Thomas Kyd, and that is forthcoming.
Yeah, so volume 1, we're hoping will be out in March 2024. So been a long time coming, this edition. It's the first critical edition of Thomas Kyd's collected works since 1901.
Wow. All right, so we'll come back to Thomas Kyd and Robert Greene in just a moment, but let's take a second to explore your history. How, Darren, did you, as a young gentleman in the UK, decide to go on this journey into becoming an educator and a scholar of Shakespeare?
Oh, it's such a difficult thing to pinpoint that. I mean, my relationship with Shakespeare goes back to being a high school student, I think, and encountering Julius Caesar and being enthralled by that story of, corruption, assassination, and so forth. And I always had an interest in acting and literature. And I remember encountering Sonnet 18 and entirely on my own volition deciding to memorize that sonnet and feeling empowered by the language. But I think a real important moment for me in my journey was studying King Lear the age of around 16, 17. I had a fantastic educator for that. I had a fantastic teacher. And that play just gripped me. And, you know, even though I was in my salad days, the profundity of the themes, I just got this sense that, you know, this dude gets me, or, you know, this dude knows what the world is about. So I ended up doing literature at university, and I did want to go to drama school. So that's kind of the journey I saw myself going in. But I did a module in my third year as an undergraduate on Shakespeare and bibliography. And there I encountered the collaborative play, The Book of Sir Thomas More. So the manuscript for that play is kept at the British Library. We believe it's the only surviving example of Shakespeare's dramatic handwriting. And with that play being such a collaborative play, around 5 different authors involved, I was just captivated by the different styles, the ways in which these authors' voices communed. So I went on to do the PhD, got some teaching under my belt at Cardiff University, loved it. I absolutely love being an educator. And I guess that's what really spurred my journey in Shakespeare academia.
And then at what point after your studies were completed did you join the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust?
Well, there was an intermission. So I spent 2 years working for an e-learning company that specialized in business and medical courses. And I sort of spent every day of those 2 years wondering, what the hell am I doing here? You know, I want to talk about Shakespeare all the time. But I learned a great deal in terms of digital pedagogy. So after those 2 years, 2018 was when I started at the trust. So I've been there around 5 years now.
Okay, all right. And in that time, you've put forth a number of essays about Shakespeare and about some of his contemporaries and some of the gentlemen that you mentioned, Robert Greene, Thomas Kidd. So what inspired the deeper dives, the journeys into putting forth the research and putting the books together about these two particular figures in the world of Shakespeare history?
I was particularly interested, I think, in how Shakespeare got started. You know, Shakespeare as an actor, you know, what plays would he have acted in? You know, what plays by what dramatists? What would he have learned from them? So I was particularly interested in the ways in which Shakespeare was influenced right at the start of his career and how he collaborated with other dramatists. I think Shakespeare is so often detached from the playwriting community in which he worked. So I was really interested in seeing Shakespeare is one member of a broad and brilliant community of dramatists. And there are so many gaps, I think, in our knowledge when it comes to some of those Elizabethan playwrights, such as Robert Greene, such as Thomas Kidd, who I think don't get the credit they deserve in comparison to the likes of Christopher Marlowe or Thomas Middleton, for instance. So I guess I saw an opportunity there to increase knowledge. And also I saw some gaps in the market, I think, because with Robert Greene, there hasn't been an edition of his work since 1909. And I think it's really key for our appreciation of Shakespeare to broaden our understanding of his predecessors, of his contemporaries, and produce high quality editions of their works for readers and theatre practitioners.
Absolutely. That gives us a broader context of what the environment that Shakespeare was producing his works in, and who, as you say, was influencing, who was perhaps were his rivals in the case of Robert Greene. So in terms of how contemporaneous they were with Shakespeare, were Robert Greene and Thomas Kidd both active at the same time as Shakespeare, or did one precede him?
Great question. There is some overlap. So they can be called predecessors of Shakespeare, but they're also, you know, contemporaneous. So around 1593 to 1594, Shakespeare's been writing for around 3 years. And suddenly you've got the loss of these huge dramatists, such as Robert Greene, such as Christopher Marlowe, such as Thomas Kidd. So yeah, there's slight overlap there. And I would actually argue in the case of Thomas Kidd that they did work together in the final couple of years of Thomas Kidd's life.
Okay, and that's perhaps something that you're referring to in the case of Sir Thomas More, which is a collaborative effort between Shakespeare and some others. Is Thomas
Yeah,
Ridge still contributing?
Thomas More a little bit. Thomas More a little bit later. So Thomas More 1600. So we think Shakespeare's working with the likes of Thomas Hayward, Thomas Dekker, Henry Shettle, Anthony Mundy. With Thomas Kyd, I would argue that they collaborated directly on the reign of King Edward III, probably around 1593, I think. So just a couple of years into Shakespeare's writing career. And I would argue that the play known as Henry VI Part 1 in the 1623 First Folio is a revision by Shakespeare of a play known as Harry VI by Thomas Nash and Thomas Kyd. And also it's a fairly new development, the fourth quarto edition of the Spanish tragedy, those additional passages. Authorship scholars tend to agree that Shakespeare was involved in writing those additional passages for that revision. So I think Shakespeare has something of a career-long engagement with the works of Thomas Kyd in particular.
Now, would you consider yourself, or would others consider you as someone who is an attribution scholar? As someone who is that one of your areas of expertise?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. It almost feels like a dirty term, doesn't it? Attribution scholar. It gets a bit of a bad rep as a field, but I love it. I think attribution studies it's really broadening. It gives us opportunities to develop our knowledge on how playwrights work together, how companies competed and collaborated, broaden our knowledge of repertory studies. And I've always been fascinated by the textual sleuthing involved.
Right.
Sort of trying to consider myself something of a early modern Sherlock Holmes and just analysing those texts and delving into the minutiae. I get very excited about that. I know it's not for everybody, but I enjoy it.
I think it's fascinating. We were speaking to someone on our program about maybe 6 months or a year ago, and he had put together a book about how he saw in the works of Shakespeare the same patterns of writing of Thomas North, and and I'm sure there's some overlap between Thomas North and Robert Greene and Thomas Kyd. I think they're all contemporaneous, more or less. So in terms of the works of Shakespeare, we all know that right now it's 2023. It's the 400th year of since the release of the first folio in 1623, and in that first folio, we know that there were 36 plays at that time, and then at various times that is bumped up to 37. Sometimes people say that maybe Two Noble Kinsmen might have been in there, but what's the real information? That there's the first folio, and then there's the other folios, and then there's the quartos and the bad quartos. Give us just like a simple way to understand the difference between all those texts and why there's different numbers of Shakespeare's plays.
Give us the proper information here. I love that phrasing. It's very complex question. I would say, you've got the first folio, 36 plays. I would say Shakespeare contributed to 43 plays in total. So outside of the first folio, I'd say he contributed to Pericles, Two Noble Kinsmen, those Spanish tragedies, 1602 editions I mentioned, Book of Sir Thomas More, and Edward III we've mentioned. Also the lost play Cardenio, which might survive through a 1727 adaptation called Double Falsehood, and the lost play Love's Labour's Won. But in terms of that distinction between folio and quartos, so 18 of the plays in the first folio hadn't been printed in individual editions before. So without the publication of the 1623 first folio, around half of Shakespeare's plays might conceivably be lost to us. So that word folio derives from the Latin word folium, meaning leaf. So you produce the first folio by folding a sheet of paper just once. So folios were, large, sturdy, fairly expensive volumes, usually reserved for weighty matters such as chronicle history or religion. And then you've got the quartos. So around half of Shakespeare's plays have been printed in quarto edition before. So these are smaller books produced by folding a sheet of paper 4 times. and they would have cost around 6 pence, as opposed to around 15 to 20 shillings for a folio. You also have octavos, which are even smaller books produced by folding a sheet of paper 8 times. When it comes to that distinction between a good and a bad quarto, this is something scholars have been wrestling with for a very long time. And that notion of a bad quarto, that pretty much stems from the early 20th century, a book by a bibliographer named A.W. Pollard, written in 1909, and the work of a bibliographer named W.W. Gregg. So the theory is that some quarto editions are manifestly corrupt. They've got adding phrases like marry or I prithee. They're much shorter than the supposedly good versions of plays. There's a lot of mix between prose and verse, or just fustian verse in general. And there's numerous theories as to the origins of these bad quartos. So a writer we mentioned earlier, Thomas Haywood, claims that some works were copied only by the ear. So potentially you've got audience members at the theatres, and they're either trying to remember the play they've potentially seen numerous times, or they think that play is meet to set down in their tables. So they're potentially scribbling away in the theatre. It's a bit like bringing a phone to the cinema, I think. It's a form of piracy. And there's also the theory of memorial reconstruction when it comes to actors. So potentially actors involved in productions of Shakespeare and his contemporaries' plays, trying to piece these plays together from memories in rehearsal and in performance. So there's a 1602 bad quarto of The Merry Wives of Windsor, which has been theorized the actor who played the host was responsible largely for that. There's the very corrupt first quarto of Hamlet, which it's been postulated the actor playing Marcellus was involved in putting that together. So it's a bit of a quagmire, and that term memorial reconstruction, it's a bit like saying Voldemort in the Harry Potter universe. It's a bit of a no-go area, but I think it's an area that probably needs a bit of revisiting. So there's lots of mysteries still abounding when it comes to the origins of quartos, but I think there's a great deal more work to do, and maybe revisiting some of the older scholarship, which had its flaws, but was also quite detailed and made sense from some perspectives, I think.
For what it was at the time that it was being done. And now,
what's that, sorry?
For the time that it was being done and the technology or the resources that were available to them, I'm sure that was a very advanced way of reading the text or reading the history, but perhaps with more digital tools or different things available to us now, perhaps a deeper level of understanding can be attained. Now, in terms of memorial reconstruction of the text, how is that the memorial reconstruction? How does that coincide with or be opposed to the retention of different sides that the actors used from the plays?
Different what? Sorry, different.
The sides that the actors would have had from the performance of the plays. The cue scripts, the sides.
Oh yeah. Well, this is a tricky thing when the actors would have only had their lines and their cues, but this is something I've been very interested in terms of actor memory and oral understanding. And I think, when you have a look at Shakespeare, he's an actor as well as a playwright. He's got a capacious verbal memory. And something I've been doing with a current project is charting Shakespeare's borrowings from plays of the period, going back to the 1580s, all the way to the Jacobean periods. And it's quite phenomenal, Shakespeare's retention of lines from other playwrights. And, one of the kind of distinctions when it comes to the bad quartos is that they supposedly contain a lot of lines filched from other plays. But it's very difficult to make that distinction between, a piratical actor involved in a Shakespeare play, or simply Shakespeare being so deeply rooted in the theatrical vernacular of the period in which he was writing.
Yeah, and I'm sure that much scholarship goes into finding the line between those gray areas.
Yeah, it's very grey and very blurry, Rodney. Yes,
Indeed. So we mentioned some of the names of the plays that could be considered apocryphal plays. Now here are some other titles, and let me know what you think of these. What about Fair M?
Fair M, the Miller's Daughter of Manchester. I would attribute that to Thomas Kidd.
Okay, I'm sure that appears in your volume about Thomas Kidd.
Yes, yeah, that'll be in volume 2. Yes.
Okay, and for Robert Greene, Musidorus, I'm sure that's one of his titles.
Oh no, we just don't know the author of Musidorus, and I've not found any evidence for Robert Greene or any other author,
Really?
which is very curious because it was a hugely popular play, Musidorus, and I'd love to, work out who was responsible for the original text and the additions, which have sometimes been given to either Shakespeare or Ben Jonson. So lots of work still to do on Musidorus, I think.
Very interesting. Okay, what about All Is True?
Oh, that's All Is True is an alternative title for Henry VIII, which is in the first folio. So that's a Shakespeare and John Fletcher collaboration, which was responsible for burning down the Globe Theatre in 1613, because it's a play full of spectacle and pageantry. And during the course of the play, a cannon went off, set fire to the thatched roof, and remarkably, for a theatre with a potential capacity of 3,000 people, the only casualty was a man's breeches, which would apparently put out with a bottle of ale.
Now, I think there needs to be a film version of that at some point.
Oh, yes.
All right. Well, we can dig deeper into some of the questions about the Apocrypha and things like that. But why don't we look at some of the texts that Shakespeare had available to him during the time that he was a playwright? We know that some of the texts that he drew from include the Bible, Ovid's Metamorphoses, Plutarch's Lives, and Holinshed's Chronicles. In the research that you've done, and the work that you've done about Robert Greene, Thomas Kidd, and some of the other research that you've done, do you have any other primary sources that he would have referred to, or are those pretty much the main 4?
Oh, yeah. I mean, dramatists of the period were just ransacking literary materials. And, when you're thinking of Shakespeare's most important sources, it's tricky, isn't it? What distinction you're making? Is this in terms of plot? Is this in terms of tone, the thematics he's exploring, characterization? But I think a very important source you didn't mention, Giraldi Cinthio's Hecatomachy, printed in 1565. So this is a source Shakespeare uses for Measure and Othello. And I think you can really get a good sense of Shakespeare's genius and his craftsmanship when looking at, how he adapts this source for Othello, for instance. So in Cinthio, Iago's motivation, very clear. He fancies Desdemona. She doesn't fancy him back. He wants revenge. So, this is something I find students constantly grappling with. What was Iago's motivation? Why is he so keen to ensure the downfall of Othello? And Shakespeare just gives us a whole plurality of different potential motivations, because I think Shakespeare wants his audiences to leave the theatre still asking questions. He loves raising questions, Shakespeare. Very rarely provides firm answers on anything, I find. So Shakespeare, he can adapt these source materials that have fairly clear-cut answers. And I think he likes to blur the boundaries, to dilute those answers, which is what makes him a great dramatist, I think. You've also got Matteo Bandello, thinking of Italian work. So Bandello providing source material for Cymbeline, Romeo and Juliet, Much Ado About Nothing, Twelfth Night. Then you've got Giovanni Boccaccio, thinking along an Italian theme again. So Shakespeare used that for All's Well That Ends Well, Cymbeline, The Two Gentlemen of Verona. Shakespeare also uses French sources like Francois de Belforest for Hamlet. which is essentially a translation of a Danish work by Saxo Grammaticus. One of the most important sources for Shakespeare and almost all of his contemporary playwrights, I would say, is the Roman tragedian Lucius Annaeus Seneca. So Seneca, responsible for such works as the Madness of Hercules, Agamemnon, Thyestes. And when we stereotype Seneca, we tend to think of, ghosts bellowing for revenge, ranty, bombastic language, bloody violence. But what you also see with Seneca is an emphasis on providentialism. So this idea of divine or supernatural forces having a say in a play's outcome, which when it comes to Shakespeare turning to English history, that dovetails really nicely, I think, that idea of historical fatalism, particularly with the growing Calvinism of the period. So Seneca, a huge influence on Shakespeare, I think, particularly in that tension we find throughout his plays, particularly his tragedies, between the idea of fate and providence on the one side, and the idea of free will and human action on the other. So Shakespeare, it just so many sources he's engaging with. I haven't even mentioned Philip Sidney's Arcadia in the case of King Lear, for instance, or the works of Geoffrey Chaucer in terms of the two noble kinsmen, Midsummer Night's Dream, Troilus and Cressida. Shakespeare demonstrably an avid reader, I think.
That's a great breakdown, Darren, of all these different sources. And it's in many places that you read, it talks about how in the 1590s and the 1600s, England, London especially, was really like the crossroads of the world at that time. And you had people from Italy, people from France, all over Europe coming into a very metropolitan for that era. London. So the fact that these influences were coming into the cultural zeitgeist, and that Shakespeare was capturing those and incorporating those into his works, I'm sure gave the audience all the more reason to come see a play that in some way reflected the exotic reality that was starting to invade their locale.
Such an exciting period. You just think of the explosion of print and literature and the development of commercial theatre, just an incredible time period. And I'm quite happy to devote my life to studying it, I think.
That's wonderful. So Darren, now that we're here at the 400th anniversary of the first folio, and you've got all these wonderful things that are happening at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, I'll get that right before the end of the program. And in so many other venues around the world, Shakespeare, it seems like Shakespeare is bigger and more pervasive now than he has ever been. For 400 years old, he's hitting the stride of his career at this point.
Like a colossus.
Right. So where do you see the Shakespeare scholarship, Shakespeare education, Shakespeare in general moving in 2023 and beyond?
Oh, it's such an exciting time. And, Shakespeare studies, like I said, as a lecturer, I lecture on so many different topics because Shakespeare studies is just huge. And I think there are really exciting things coming up in terms of thinking about Shakespeare and race, Shakespeare and gender, Shakespeare and sexuality, theatre history. New discoveries are being made all the time. What I particularly enjoyed about some of the works coming out this year is the focus on canon construction. So looking at, the personnel involved in putting together the first folio, their intertwined lives. I think something that, from a subjective perspective, particularly excites me, and I think it's the route we're going to go down, is seeing Shakespeare as a member of a community of playwrights, very much embedded in a network of affiliation and indebtedness within the early modern writing scene. So I think there'll be more focus on Shakespeare's influences, his predecessors, his contemporaries. And I think we're going to see some really exciting editions of, other major playwrights' works. So the likes of Thomas Kyd, the likes of Robert Greene, the likes of Thomas Nash, John Marston, and so forth. And I think that will really deepen our appreciation of Shakespeare, seeing the ways in which he interacted with and sometimes turned away from fellow dramatists.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned early on, we only think of really Christopher Marlowe and maybe one or two others, but there were so many others that contributed so heavily to what was going on in the contemporary times of Shakespeare. And I'm so happy to be able to engage with someone like yourself, who's digging into that history and bringing that reality to the contemporary audience. So bravo to you, Darren, for all of the work you're doing. And if people want to come check out your website or come check out some of the books that you've released about Robert Greene, Thomas Kidd, and your various essays, where can they go to find that all that information?
So my website is darrenfj.wordpress.com. And if anyone's interested in some of the Trust's offerings and the sort of lecture programs that I'm involved in, they can go to shakespeare.org.uk. But my website lists all of my publications and so forth. So yeah, it'd be lovely if people checked out those websites.
All right, and guys, you don't have to worry about booking a transatlantic crossing to be able to check those out. All you have to do is go on your phone or on the web, and you can get all that content from our dear friend, Dr. Darren Freebury-Jones. Darren, thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening and this afternoon, and enlightening us about the mysteries behind some of the apocryphal plays of Shakespeare, about the connections to his contemporaries, Robert Greene and Thomas Kidd. And I encourage the audience to check out your website, check out the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, got it, website, and connecting with your books and connecting with you on social media to see everything that you're up to. So Darren, thank you so much. I wish you all the best, and we hope to connect with you again in the future.
Thank you so much, Rodney. I've had so much fun, and so thank you so much for having me on.
All right, it's a pleasure. Audience out there, we